Good morning, everyone. Welcome to chapter 3 of our book we're reading, Refugee. Remember to signpost along and then send it to me for extra credit. So, chapter 3 introduces a new character, Mahmoud. Mahmoud is a Syrian boy, and the time is set in 2015, right? So, 5 years ago. Yeah, it's 2020. 5 years ago, in Syria. So Syria is in the Middle East, and it's still ongoing, but they have had a major civil war, which has caused just the destruction of the country and a refugee crisis out of Syria. So, under my understanding is that what happened is the people were protesting the government because they were calling the government corrupt and telling the leader he needed to step down. He refused to do so and militarized, and rebel groups formed, and because of that, they've had a massive civil war, which has been just terrible. I believe over 400,000 people have died because of this conflict, right? This is ongoing right now on our Earth's soil, and it has actually caused a fairly terrible refugee crisis because Syria used to house a lot of refugees, especially coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq from the wars ongoing there. So, what happened is for a lot of those refugees, it's caused a second wave of refugees, right? First, they had to escape their home country into Syria, and now they're escaping Syria because of that. This character's name is Mahmoud. He's in Aleppo, Syria, 2015, which Aleppo is one of the major cities that this conflict has been engaged in. Mahmoud Bishara was invisible, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Being invisible is how he survived. He wasn't literally invisible. If you really looked at Mahmoud, you got a glimpse under the hoodie he kept pulled down over his face. You could see the 12-year-old boy with a long, strong nose, thick black eyebrows, and short, cropped black hair. He was stocky, his shoulders wide and muscular despite food shortages. But Mahmoud did everything he could to hide his side and his face to stay under the radar. Random death from a fighter's jet missile or a soldier's rocket launcher may come at any moment. When you least expected it, to walk around getting noticed by the Syrian army or rebels fighting them was just inviting trouble. Mahmoud sat in the middle row of desks in his classroom where the teacher wouldn't call on him. The desks were wide enough for 3 students at each, and Mahmoud sat between 2 other boys named Ahmed and Needle. Ahmed and Needle weren't his friends. Mahmoud didn't have any friends. It was easier to stay invisible this way. One of the teachers walked up and down the hallway ringing a handbell, and Mahmoud collected his backpack and went to go find his little brother Walid. Walid was 10 years old and 2 grades below Mahmoud in school. He too wore his black hair cropped short, but he looked more like their mother with narrow shoulders, thinner eyebrows, a flatter nose, and bigger ears. His teeth looked too big for his head, and when he smiled, he looked like a cartoon squirrel. Not that Walid smiled much anymore. Mahmoud couldn't remember the last time he had seen his brother laugh or cry or show any emotion whatsoever. The war had made Mahmoud nervous, twitchy, paranoid. It had made his little brother a robot. Even though their apartment wasn't far away, Mahmoud led Walid on a different route home every day. Sometimes it was back alleys. There could be fighters on the streets who were always targets for the opposition. Bombed out buildings were good too. Mahmoud and Walid could disappear among the heaps of twisted metal and broken cement, and there were no walls to fall on them if an artillery shell went whizzing overhead. If a plane dropped a barrel bomb, though, you needed walls. Barrel bombs were filled with nails and scrap metal, and if you didn't have a wall to duck behind, you'd be shredded to pieces. It hadn't always been this way. So we're going into like a memory moment, which the author has been adding these memory moments as more factual to kind of tell the background story of what country they're talking about. So we're going to go into a memory moment about what kind of led to this civil war. It hadn't always been this way. Just 4 years ago, their home of Aleppo had been the biggest, brightest, most modern city in Syria, a crown jewel of the Middle East. Mahmoud remembered neon malls, glittering skyscrapers, soccer stadiums, movie theaters, museums. Aleppo had a history too, a long history. The old city at the heart of Aleppo was built around the 12th century, and people have lived in this area as early as 8,000 years ago. Aleppo had been an amazing city to grow up in, until 2011 when the Arab Spring came to Syria. They didn't call it that then. Nobody knew a wave of revolutions would sweep through the Middle East, toppling governments and overthrowing dictators and starting civil wars. All they knew from images on TV and posts on Facebook and Twitter was that people in Tunisia and Libya and Yemen were rioting in the streets. And as each country stood up and said enough, so did the next one and the next one, until at last the Arab Spring came to Syria. So it was in 2011. This happened actually in Egypt too. It was multiple countries had these civilian-led revolutions that they just said enough, that they were tired of governmental corrupt. And then they started to stand up, which has led to some very scary, but, conflicts around the world. Like Yemen is in the middle of a civil war right now. But Syrians knew protesting in the streets was dangerous. Syria was ruled by Bashar al-Assad, who had twice been elected president. Elected is in quotation marks because it's supposed to be elected president, which shows that he wasn't truly elected president. He had been twice elected president when no one was allowed to run against him. So that's how he was elected president. He wouldn't allow anyone to run as opposition. Assad made people who didn't like him disappear forever. Everyone was afraid of what he would do if the Arab Spring swept through Syria. There was an old Arabic proverb that said, "Close the door that brings the wind and relax." That's exactly what they did. While the rest of the Middle East was rioting, Syrians stayed inside and locked their doors and waited to see what would happen. But they didn't close the door tight enough. A man in Damascus, the capital of Syria, was imprisoned for speaking out against Assad. Some kids in Dara, a city in southern Syria, were arrested and abused by the police for writing an anti-Assad slogan on the walls. And then the whole country seemed to go crazy all at once. Tens of thousands of people poured onto the streets, demanding the release of political prisoners and more freedom for everyone. Within a month, Assad had turned his tanks and soldiers and bombers on the protesters, on his own people. And ever since then, all Mahmoud and Walid and anyone else in Syria had known its war. So we can log this quote that Assad... Sorry, just trying to find the quote. Man, you would think by now I would figure out this camera, but apparently if I do this by the end of this, it will be Mrs. Cook's teaching success. So we're going to take it, the quote we're going to take, you should see italicized for the words people. I'll read the quote out. It says, "Within a month, Assad had taken his tanks and soldiers and bombers on the protesters and on his own people." So my finger is where you see italicized people. So we're going to take that as again and again. Only this time, before we logged the italicized font as again and again for when they gave a word in a different language that wasn't English. But in this case, this again and again is for emphasis. So if you think about it, first, his tanks and soldiers and bombers, right? So we're not talking about them friendly arresting. We're talking about them, the military, killing people. So first it was on protesters and then on his own people. By putting emphasis on this word people, it shows us that now, the military is attacking civilians, attacking his people. And ever since then, all Mahmoud and Walid and anyone else in Syria had known was war. Mahmoud and Walid turned down a different rubble-strewn alley that day before and stopped dead. Just ahead of them, two boys had another boy up against what was left of a wall and were about to take a bag of bread he carried. Mahmoud pulled Walid behind a burned-out car, his heart racing. Incidences like this were common in Aleppo lately. It was getting harder and harder to find food in the city. But for Mahmoud, the scene brought back memories of another time just before the war had begun. Mahmoud, so we're going into a memory moment. Mahmoud had been going to meet his best friend, Khalid. Down a side street, just like this one, Mahmoud found Khalid being beaten up by two older boys. Khalid was a Shia Muslim in the city of mostly Sunni Muslims. So in the Muslim religion, there's two sects. Just like in Christianity, we have tons of different kinds of branches of Christianity. You can be Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Methodist, right? So they have two sects. And there has been a lot of prejudice and hostility between those two sects or two parts of Islam. So we're living in a memory moment here. Khalid was clever, smart, always quick to raise his hands in class, and always with the right answer. He and Mahmoud had known each other for years, and even though Mahmoud was Sunni and Khalid was Shia, they had never mattered to them. They liked to spend their afternoons and weekends reading comic books and watching superhero movies and playing video games. But right then, Khalid had been curled into a ball on the ground, his hand around the head while the other boys kicked him. So this memory is important, I think, because it shows the author put it in because it teaches us a little bit more about the people of Syria and some of the issues in Syria. And the second thing is because it also, for the character Mahmoud, it shows this history, like this moment of seeing violence and seeing someone beat up for different circumstances, right? Same incident, but different circumstances. "Not so smart now, are you, pig?" one of them had said. "Shias should know their place. This is Syria, not Iran." Mahmoud had bristled. The differences between Sunnis and Shiites was an excuse. These boys had just wanted someone to beat up. With a battle cry that would have made Wolverine proud, Mahmoud had launched himself at Khalid's attacker. And he had been beaten up as badly as Khalid. And from that day forward, Mahmoud and Khalid were marked. The two older boys became Mahmoud and Khalid's own personal bullies, delivering repeated beating downs between classes and after school. That's when Mahmoud and Khalid had learned how valuable it was to be invisible. Mahmoud stayed in the classroom all day, never going to the bathroom or the playground. Khalid never answered another question in class, not even when the teachers called on him directly. If the bullies don't notice you, then they don't hit you. And that's when Mahmoud had realized that together he and Khalid were bigger targets. Alone, it was easier to be invisible. It was nothing they ever said to each other, just something that they came to understand, and within a year they drifted apart, not even speaking to each other as they passed in the hall. That's really sad. Oh, this is even sadder. A year after that, Khalid had died in an airstrike anyway. It was better not to have friends in Syria in 2015. Um, I think that's a really important sentence. It shows that how scary their environment was, that at any moment you could lose people that you cared about. So the best thing you could do is just not to care or to not have those relationships. Mahmoud watched as the two boys attacked the boy with the bread, a boy he didn't even know. He felt the stirrings of indignation, of anger, of sympathy. His breath came quick and deep, and his hands clenched into fists. I should do something, he whispered, but he knew better. Head down, hoodie up, eyes on the ground. The trick was to be invisible, to blend in, to disappear. Mahmoud took his younger brother by the hand and turned around and found a different way home. All right. Next chapter, we go back to Joseph, living in Nazi Germany. His father had just been arrested. I can tell this book is going to be really powerful. When we think about, like, how humans over the years and over history have gone through such challenges. It's hard to feel hopeful in that situation. I know right now in this moment we're thinking about our own country where there are waves of protesters speaking out against the injustices done to black men and black people and people of color. Our world needs to get a lot better and a lot better faster. And with that, I'm saying goodbye. I'll see you tomorrow.